Hello, I am here again. I said I was going to be here last night. Not that necessarily people would have been tuning in and finding out that I wasn't actually here last night. I can't remember exactly what was happening, but I do believe it had something to do with listing a couch that I had. Now, I'm actually taking all of my things that I have. For those of you that haven't been following along at home, I've been somewhat homeless. It's in a less dramatic way than one might think of being homeless. Just after Tom died, there was a series of events that took place, and so I'm actually accumulating all the things back that have been at my friends' places and in storage and all these different places. And one of the things was I actually listed it as 2 funerals and a leather sofa couch, which seemed to get some attention. And because it's a very sad thing, but I thought I could try to make it somewhat humorous. I had this leather couch, a sofa couch, which is a kind of a rare combination, I guess. But I used to, when I went to visit my friend in a different city, my friend Lindsay, I used to stay on the couch. And I just really liked the couch. And so I ended up with the couch. And since that time, unfortunately, Lindsay's passed away very tragically. And my Tom passed away as well. So this couch was kind of symbolic when I brought it out of storage. I thought I didn't really want to get rid of it. But and I'm going to actually show you what I'm doing. I'm not sure if I'm going to be, I really want to focus on the work that George Webb's doing, but I'd also like to show you what I'm doing in the Airstream and when I actually get the 5th wheel, which is, it doesn't have the furniture in it. So that's what I love about it. So anyway, I've been thinking about what kind of furniture I can put in it. I've got my grandmother's dressers. Got a couple of those, and they've been in a kind of not climate controlled place anyway. And so I'm going to see what I can do in terms of making those into maybe an island in the kitchen area. And I've also got my great Aunt Peggy's chairs, and I've got my grandfather's oak chair with leather. And so, I've just honed it down to the ones that I want to put into the new space. But I'd like to show you what I'm doing. So anyway, that's kind of what I've been doing. So I think I was a bit distracted because I ended up selling. It got a lot of action when I listed the couch, and so the couch has gone bye, and I actually sold a couple of other things today too, and so I'm feeling pretty good about my ability to say this is something that I don't need in my life, and it can be tricky because some of you might know I have a lot of kids and I've accumulated a lot of things over my life. And then, of course, having all of these other things happen where you have to divest yourself of things. You either put them in storage, which is a very silly thing to do, or you find a way to use them, or you put them up for sale. And so somebody said, oh, well, if you haven't used it for 90 days, then it goes. Well, for the last year and a half, they've been in storage. So now I'm giving myself 90 days to decide whether I actually need some of the things that are now that I'm sorting through. Not that interesting, but in the huge context of things, and for those that have kind of been following the saga of my moving from this place to that place, you might be interested. And I think it's kind of cool for those that are having a hard time finding a place, or who find themselves without their own home. I feel like I would much rather have my own RV. Mind you, I do have a truck. So there's that, and I have an RV or a 5th wheel hitch. So, and I did manage to find an RV that I think is more like a tiny house than an RV in a certain way. It's kind of it's cool in the sense that it's got a bathroom and a kitchen and bedroom, that sort of thing. And actually the bathroom is like a full-size bathroom, which is really cool. And anyway, I'm just paying it off before I get it. So it didn't cost a huge amount, but I'm having to pay it off every month. And then I will be able to go get it. So that's the way it works in my world right now. That's how it's working. And speaking of that, surprisingly enough, I don't know why, but I guess YouTube has decided that I really shouldn't have super chats anymore. And I've never heard of that, because I see people all the time that have been demonetized, but they haven't had their super chat taken away. But that has been done. So I guess the only thing I can ask for is if anybody wants to buy a coffee or support the Airstream project, which includes my home, because that's all part of the thing, is that I have the Airstream is where I work, and I live in the RV, so it would have to be through PayPal, and or through Tips OK, which is my website. Check out Tips OK. I created it as a virtual guitar case, and there's no fees, there's no nothing. The only thing I ask is that if people like the service, that they tip Tips OK. And so the cool thing is that if you're at an event, like I go to a jam on Thursday nights, and you know there's no tip jar out, you can actually pass around the phone and give your artist tips that way. So you just get the little page set up. What I like about it is it's not like Patreon or any of these other things where it's the artists themselves, or in my case, me as a content provider, that's sort of saying, well, I'm going to set up this page. It's the people who are that are keen on what they're doing. So, and I'm big on supporting musicians, of course, but there's all sorts of other artists that need support. And so this is a really good way to just be able to create a page, just send a picture. Right now it's going through me, so you would let me know. You go over to tipsok.com and just send the information that you want, and then we put it up there, and then literally it's live right away, and it's just set up so that you can give various denominations as tips, and then all we need is either your PayPal address or the artist's PayPal address, and it gets paid out that way. It's very straightforward. It's so simple. And that's what I love about it. It's literally like having a guitar case open or passing the hat around. So, and it can be for any occasion. It can be for anything that you want it to be for, like at a wedding. Sometimes I used to go to weddings where the bride would dance, and it was always the bride, and I thought, this is, she's just gone through all this stuff. She's been up since 5 o'clock in the morning getting her hair done, and now she's got to dance all night. But it's the Hungarian way, I think. It was my cousin married a wonderful Hungarian woman many, many years ago, and she was an Hungarian dancer. And I just noticed that he didn't have to do a lot of dancing, but she's much cuter anyway. So I guess that's the deal. That's how it works. The fella's paid to dance with the bride, but she's already taken. So the other thing that happened today that was interesting was I tuned in every once in a while. I go over to Scott Adams' channel, and I do find it frustrating because, I like to get a lot of different ideas and a lot of input and see the various perspectives that people have, within reason. I don't really want to go over to mainstream media because I've already heard all about what they're saying. It's the same thing as the NPC meme thing. It's like, you're just going to hear the same thing. And I just, after a while, can't, it's not worth it. It's not worth your time or energy. But going over to the other channels is good. So I'd been over to Scott's channel, and then I went over to, last night I was watching Dan Bongino because I wanted to see the his Papadopoulos interview. So he had the first, and it wasn't. He has sort of a radio channel or a podcast channel, so it wasn't with any video, but I just wanted to hear what George had to say. So I'm calling this the Georges. I'm talking about Georges today because there's George Webb, there's George Soros, and there's George Papadopoulos. And so I just thought it was kind of funny because those were the three kind of figures that were that I was looking into, and it turned out that they're all Georges. So one of the things that Scott was talking about is he said there's no evidence that George Soros, I can't remember, I don't want to misquote him, but this is not an exact quote. This is just me saying the rough idea was that there was no evidence that George Soros was collaborating with the Nazis. And so I don't know what his actual, what his criteria is for collaborating. But I had to, I'm rebutting that because I think that collaborating is when you give aid and comfort of any kind to people that are doing, even if they're doing crappy things to some, let's just bring it down to, okay, so there's somebody that we know just did something really nasty to somebody else. Let's just keep it at the least emotional level that we can. And they've just told you, or you found out that this thing happened. So it's not as though you didn't know either. And yes, okay, you're 14 years old, but I say that there's a lot of things we do when we're 14. A lot of 14-year-olds want to be considered to be older. They're considering letting 14 or 15-year-olds have the vote, maybe 16. But you're not that far away from being able to drive a car, for instance. Okay, so let's just say 14 years old is not, you're not a baby at that point. And in a lot of cultures, people who are 14 are considered to be able to participate fully. In the Jewish community, they have their bar mitzvah at 13. So, it can't just be this thing where you go, oh, well, in this case, 14 is too young, and in this case, it's too old. Like, let's just make a decision and say, are they accountable? Well, I have a sense that the age of accountability is 12, just because when I was growing up, for some reason, that was the thing. You can actually say yes or no. And I know in the court system, if a child is actually weighing in on whether they want to live with one parent or another, they can. The judge takes their testimony into consideration, takes their story into consideration. So I do think that 14 is fine. And in the old days, when George was growing up, particularly in the time that he was growing up, 14-year-olds were actually going off to war. So I'm not saying it was the norm. I'm just saying that they were. And so, we're not talking about a kid here. So I'm putting this in that context that I think somehow Scott Adams thought that being George Soros being 14, I don't know what his criteria is, but he just had discounted the idea that George Soros was involved at all in anything to do with the Second World War and persecuting the Jews. And I do know he's Jewish. He was born in Hungary, and he is a Jew. So that is even, to me, more egregious. So there's a man that basically took him, hid him, sort of hid his Jewishness, and in that way protected George Soros. And I have no problem with that. I think that that's an act of kindness, that a lot of people were doing that. I read a book by Corrie ten Boom called The Hiding Place when I was much younger. And, they took Jews into their house, and they hid them. And being Jewish myself, I can certainly appreciate this, and I think it's amazing that people do that. This is kind of a different situation. So the person who was so basically they kind of he was cloaked with his godfather's faith, I guess, and he was considered to be a Christian. And so this fellow that was posing as a Christian, his godfather, was tasked with going into the houses of Jews that have been taken off to death camps and taking their stuff, getting their stuff. And so, he doesn't say much more than that, but we do know from his own testimony, his own words, that he did that. So I just wanted to refresh people's minds in case they have not seen this interview. This was, I believe, could have been 1976, I think. And so, it's George talking about, he's on 60 Minutes. I think it was 76, but anyway, it was a while back, but it doesn't really matter when it is. The main thing is that it is actually George who is talking. He's discussing the situation himself. So, there's no real question about him being misquoted, that sort of thing. So I'm just trying to line it up here. I'm still working a little bit on getting my bearings here, but let's just go with this. And I'm just going to play a little bit of this interview. Okay, so that's who's it's on 60 Minutes, and we'll start with him.
My understanding is that you went out with this protector of yours who swore that you were his adopted godson.
Yes.
Went out, in fact, and helped in the confiscation of property from the Jews.
That's right. Yes.
I mean, that sounds like an experience that would send lots of people to the psychiatric couch for many, many years. Was it difficult?
Not at all. Not at all. Maybe as a child you don't see the connection, but it created no problem at all.
No feeling of guilt.
No.
For example, that I'm Jewish, and here I am watching these people go. I could just as easily be there. I should be there. None of that.
Well, of course, I could be on the other side, or I could be the one from whom the thing is being taken away. But there was no sense that I shouldn't be there, because that was, well, actually, funny way, it's just like in markets, that if I weren't there, of course I wasn't doing it, but somebody else would be taking it away anyhow. And it was whether I was there or not, I was only a spectator, the property was being taken away. So I had no role in taking away that property. So I had no sense of guilt.
Are you religious?
No.
Do you believe in God?
No.
Soros told us he believes God was created by man, not the other way around, which may be why he thinks he can smooth out the world's imperfections. When we went with him...
Okay, I think we'll just leave it at that. And, it's not all the context in the world, and there's another part of that interview that is interesting as well. But I think, just to clarify, and this just goes to my point about Scott Adams, because he was saying that he didn't feel like there was evidence that George Soros had been involved in any of this. And so, of course, George says, I was just a spectator. He says he doesn't feel guilty, or he was just a kid, or whatever. And so, again, I think about this in terms of character, and in terms of some of the things that we talk about on this channel, and that I talked to Dr. Judy about earlier in the year. We were discussing the idea of honesty. So there are things that happen to us when we're kids, and sometimes we don't have any control over it. But there are ways in which we can say that it does bother us, and that we do feel badly, and that we can actually have a sense of remorse. I think it's telling that he doesn't have, he doesn't believe in God. So, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have to believe in God. It just means that there is that kind of basic tenet that we want to, we want the world to be a peaceful place. We want it to be a safe place. And I think unless we have a sense that whatever we are doing to other people could be done to us, even if it's totally mercenary and totally about ourselves and protecting ourselves, I think that is a really important consideration, even if we're not God-fearing in that sense, just to make the world a better place. But he has kept that ethic, and I can't remember if he said it in that particular cut, but he said it shaped his character. I think it's actually in another cut, and I think that's a really important aspect to it. He said, in many ways, that experience shaped his character. So I feel like that kind of contradicts what he just said about how he was just a bystander and didn't have anything to do with it, because he's saying it in a positive way, because basically he's saying that he's able to be, I would call it mercenary, cutthroat, but he would say that he's able to be a good businessman because he can go in and totally screw the people of a certain country, which he's done with Asian countries and Hungary, his own country, all sorts of countries around the world. And so it's that mindset that I want to bring to bear on the conversation when we're saying, well, this is a Soros-funded activity, because some people would say, well, you don't want to paint Soros with that brush and da-da-da. Soros does it himself. He doesn't have a problem with it. He doesn't mind bringing down countries. He has a particular point of view. He has a particular worldview. Whether he was a godly man or not, if people say that, for instance, Christians will have a point of view that they're trying to inflict on other people. Well, I say everybody has a point of view that they're trying to inflict on another person if they're not self-aware, and if they're not. If that's if that's the agenda, I don't think that necessarily people who are God-fearing have an agenda, but you can see that Soros definitely does. There's the interview is it's on Red Pill Square. So go take a look if you want to, because I put it up there. There's quite a bit of information about George Soros. So what I'm putting out there is that I feel like someone like Scott Adams is an apologist, I guess, or he's basically saying that we don't want to accuse George Soros of being a Nazi sympathizer, or that his actions are untoward in any way. But I would suggest that he, in his own words, is saying that. I don't think he thinks that his actions are wrong in any way. So that would be my comeback with Scott, is that if I was talking to him, I'd say, we don't need to apologize for George Soros, because he doesn't apologize for himself. He thinks that what he does is absolutely fine. And so it's like people who wear a hijab, or people who do things as part of their culture, part of their religious beliefs. It's not something that we would necessarily do, but they don't apologize for it. They do it, and they are quite happy to fulfill the terms of their belief system, or their religious system, which is, it's sort of interesting, because people will say, well, they're not religious. Well, yeah, you have your own religion that you're, and in George Soros's case, that he shoves down people's throat. Gee, what a surprise I'm not monetized, so I can just, I don't care anymore. They've taken away the super chat, they've taken away the monetization, and I find that interesting, because I think it's, I'm not a big channel, but I think the things that I say, concern those that are trying to control the narrative in whatever way that is. And I've been doing that over the years, and I do that with my radio show as well. I have people on who kind of go right to the heart of the thing. We don't just sit around talking about it. We just go, okay, this is actually what's happening. And I've had that happen on the radio show, and I've had various people on who are rocking the boat, and in the way that they're pointing out the whatever the globalists, when with Rosa Corey, when I had her on, she was talking about Agenda 21, which they've changed the name of. But I think there's certain people who really get under their skin, because they started off being, in her case, a Democrat who is just minding her own business, and she started to see this greening and the sustainability and all the rest of it that started to get her thinking about what was going on, and she looked into it. So I think sometimes those people are a bit more of a threat, and particularly if I put Soros's name in the description, they're probably looking for this kind of thing, because he's behind everything. And actually in that particular show, you see him with Hillary Clinton introducing her to Haiti, which I would really like to look more into that too. But I would have no problem with thinking that Soros set up Bill and Hillary Clinton, had them figure out their global initiative, their foundations, because he has a foundation as well. That's the way they scam money from people. That's how they get their billions. Anyway, I think George is behind the caravan. The mob that is at the border, and I think they're actually close to the border. You see people being paid. It doesn't really matter whether it's him or anyone else, but my whole point is that there are people who have an agenda, whether it's globalization, migration, whatever. Which the migration, if you understand it, the way that someone like George Soros, or the way that you can see it, they're behind the EU. They wanted to create an Amero, just like they had a Euro. Things are not working the way that they'd wanted to. They were going along swimmingly. The point is that a few people at the top are able to exploit the entire world at the more global that it goes. And this is the sustainability, the Agenda 21. It all plays into this whole idea that we have no borders. And so you can see that Trump is coming along and absolutely annihilating the concept of globalization. So you can see what's at the heart of this. And then you can also see why someone like George Papadopoulos, who was interviewed by Dan Bongino last night, you can see how he fits into the whole system, because you've got people like Soros who are at the top of the thing. I'm not suggesting that he moves all the chess pieces, but he's got his people. Or he's basically going, we need to get Trump, right? So now we have a whole move afoot, and now we've got Dan Bongino. If you've gone over to his channel, you'll know he's ex-Secret Service. He was Secret Service when Obama was in office, and he has a lot of inside scoop. But sometimes I think, like he does have a lot of background, but I don't think he gets the whole story. So when I was listening to this interview in the context of having listened to George Webb, so now we have our three Georges. We have George Soros, George Papadopoulos, and George Webb. When I was listening to this with Dan Bongino, I thought, the guy sounds sincere, but it doesn't jibe with what I've been hearing, having listened to George Webb's sort of ongoing, amazing investigation. And sometimes that makes me sort of get frustrated with George Webb in the past. But I've come to the point now where I just go, okay, it's going to be revealed somehow in the news or by some metadata, which is what he goes by. We've talked about that, where it's evidence that does not lie, and he's using that. And again, he puts some things out that are just like speculation, I suppose, to a certain extent, just seeing how it fits with the whole picture. Then he comes back and he says, well, this, I wouldn't change a thing. It's exactly what's happening. So he's basically doing that now with George Papadopoulos. And what he did was, and I had no idea he was going to, but I was wondering today, I wonder what George Webb thinks about that interview, because it doesn't really jibe with because he was pretty sure that Papadopoulos had a different role than he himself was intimating. And, it sounds plausible. But then today, when I was going over to check in with George, he did address it, and he does talk about that very thing. And so I thought it was worthwhile to actually bring this to you. Now, you easily could go over and just watch this yourself, and that's fine. I just want to incorporate it into this live stream, because in case people don't understand the correlation, and in case they don't see the bigger picture here. We've got the George Soros component. The people, that he represents are the elite, the globalists, the Illuminati, whatever you want to call them, the crew, as Dr. Judy calls them, who are in charge of the move, the push toward globalism. And you can see the history with George Soros. You can see the money. You can see all of the different things that go into the toppling of. He's toppled entire nations in terms of their finances. He'll often go in and he'll say, "Oh, it's just a business move." The guy's mercenary, and he's doing it for the purpose of creating havoc. That's his modus operandi. So when I see the certain things that are happening, when I see the migrants coming north, and you see the organization, and you see the just the chaos that's going on, you go, this has the fingerprints of George Soros. And that's a lot of how George Webb works too. He says, you see the fingerprints, or you see I like his analogy of an elephant, which is, you got these blind guys, and they feel the elephant, each of them sort of feels part of it, and they figure out, and one guy thinks it's a snake, one guy thinks it's I can't remember, but, depending on which part of the elephant they're feeling. And he said these guys, what they would do is they'd have the blind guys, and then they would cut the elephant up. It's a terrible analogy, but George can do that sometimes. But it's true. They'll cut the elephant up and make it so you'll never figure out what the elephant is, and that you'll always walk around blindly. So I just thought it was a really good way of describing how these guys are operating. They want to keep us with their blindfolds on, continually guessing and going, oh, I don't know what this is, because it makes no sense. So what I'm trying to do is to make sense of, just for people that have a difficult time believing, or even, understanding or even believing that there is an agenda. There are people like George Soros, and regardless of whether he's a godly man or not, they don't have a moral base from which they're working. They're not concerned like the average person. They were looting, and maybe that's part of how he got to be that way. I don't know. I don't know what else happened in his childhood. But I'm not here to psychoanalyze George Soros, but for whatever reason, by the time he was 14, he was okay with his role of confiscating the belongings of the Jews that were sent off to the death camps. And at the age of whatever he was in his 60s, when this was recorded, he was still okay with it. So, it's not that we're putting words in people's mouths, Scott Adams. It's not, and I don't want to get after Scott. It's just that sometimes I feel like he's, to me, the example of the naive person who doesn't want to believe that the world is, like he's sort of moved over a little bit to where he just goes, yeah, this isn't good for the country, or this isn't good for the world. But he doesn't seem to want to take that extra step, and I get it, because I didn't want to do it either. It's just, my background is, I have such a long history with having had my eyes open, and I think first with my dad, who was in the Second World War, who wondered why tanks, could go 100 kilometers on 100 kilometers. I can't remember 100 kilometers, 100 miles to the gallon, basically, is what he was talking about. And then he says, and look, Joni, my Buick only gets 9 miles to the gallon. So his job was to make the tanks. He fixed them up, but he also, they used to add water to the diesel. And I talked to Andreas Kalker about that, Dr. Kalker, when I was interviewing him about sodium chloride. And he said, oh, yeah, because he makes GEAT engines. And, it's a matter of heating it up and spraying it in. But, it's not just like you add water. But some people don't realize. And I was listening to somebody about free energy, So, again, whether we're talking about where did the towers go, free energy is clearly a thing, the energy issues, Pons and Fleischmann, so there are things being covered up There are things that are not being exposed, and then there are things that are happening that we can see that are not as advertised. Whether it's buildings that have been that fall to the ground, that disappear in less time than you can actually have a billiard ball fall to the ground. Like the billiard ball would still be falling, and the building would have disappeared on 9/11. So, there's things like that you just go, okay, that's metadata. That's information that I can use in order to draw some conclusions here. So I would, it just bothers me when I hear people that draw conclusions and seem not to have the humility to be able to say, I really need to look into this before I air my opinion, because there are people like him that, he's got a lot of followers and people value his opinion. And they hold a lot of weight, and so he'll go on talk shows and that sort of thing. So I just think it's really important that we don't delve into areas where we, don't say things like, well, I don't have any evidence that George Soros was collaborating with the Nazis, and he was only 14. Okay, so that's what that is. Okay, so that's foundational, and then the next aspect is the Dan Bongino interview, which I highly recommend that you go and take a look at. Bongino, I think it's bongino.com. But anyway, he's got his own channel, and you can go over there. Now, this is not meant to in any way be disparaging, because I listened to Dan Bongino, Scott. I watched Scott Adams. I'm just saying that where my spidey senses get piqued, I'm starting to really, really go more and more and more over to where it's like, I'm going to go with my own senses on this, because sometimes you go, I don't really know enough. But because I've been watching and listening and researching around George Webb's research and going down that path, and also John B. Wells, he's another one that has some amazing people on, and what it is that it's like, I'm not buying into door number 1 or door number 2. And a lot of people have a difficult time with that. And they'll say, well, that's all there is. No, there's door number 3 and possibly door number 4. And if you take a look at where did the towers go, if you take a look at what happened on 9/11 and you take the same pattern, a lot of these guys are the same players, but you take the same pattern, and when people don't like this story, they push them over into this story, and then they push them over into this story. So it's like this is their Psyop thing, where they say, oh, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll include Debbie Wasserman Schultz in the story, and we'll include some of the things that Alex Jones was talking about in the story that he was following. It was like the shooter, which coincidentally was in the same county as him, but he didn't believe that he was basically they're trying to say that he was a conspiracy theorist, but they use specific conspiracies where you just go, okay, well, if it was the other guys that were perpetrating the conspiracy or the action, creating the false flag, then they would never have that as part of the Cesare Psyop narrative. Of course they would. That's exactly what they would do to throw you off of the scent. So what I'm trying to do here is to get you thinking along those lines, where you just go, just as you're going down this path and then you see something happen, again, exactly like that body in the middle of the street that you see, and you go, oh, that must have been a hit and run accident. And then you go down to the body and you see, okay, there's a bullet wound. You notice that the time of death was an hour ago. You start, all the assumptions have to, because even though you now go, oh, it was a bullet wound and it wasn't a car accident, now you have to say, oh, well, they've been dead for an hour, or there's all these other things that come into play. And so you have to continually be willing to go where the evidence leads, or the metadata. And that's why I think it's so difficult for people to wrap their head around George Webb, because he just as you're listening to Dan Bongino and George Papadopoulos himself, talking, the very first interview he's ever done, you go, oh, Dan was right. Dan had it all figured out, and he's asking him all these questions that are absolutely confirming everything he said. And then George looks kind of like the dummy. Okay, so that's all to say that I'm going to play this segment today. I do get kind of carried away sometimes with the information that I'm trying to give you, but I'm trying to give you context. I know it could be way too much, but on this channel, what I'm trying to do is give you context. I'm also trying to work it out in terms of character, so that we can build our own character, and we can see that when people are trying to create confusion, when they're trying to create division, I'm a Christian. I know I said I'm Jewish, and I am by birth and by blood, but I'm a Christian as well, and I've it's so easy to look at some of the scriptures, and whether you're a Christian or not, just to go, that Satan is the father of lies, for instance. Yeah, okay, so don't say it's Satan, but evil has to do with lying. When you look at the relationships that have been destroyed over lies, that is not a godly or a character-driven aspect of our personalities. Doesn't mean to say we don't lie. It just means to say, I did that. That's not good. I need to go back and make amends. That's sometimes it's guilt that gets us there. Sometimes it's just we love somebody so much we don't want to hurt them, whatever. But when you've got someone like George Soros, it just goes, well, whatever, whatever. I don't care. Have a coffee, talk amongst yourselves. I don't care. You're hearing his own words, but you're also you're seeing his body language, and you're understanding the guy does not have a sense of remorse. And look, I've talked about narcissism. I've had the marriage with the narcissist, and I will talk about that someday. Some of the stuff that I'm still having to deal with. No remorse, nothing. And it doesn't matter who suffers or it's just not a normal kind of thing for people to be that way. So now I'm going to play this cut from George. I'm not sure how much I'm going to do. Stick with me if you want to. This is just for people's edification. You may already know all this stuff. I find it fascinating. And I think that in the end, what it shows is the person who seemingly has the least amount of credibility for a lot of people, not for me, but a lot of people will, the badmouth George. And, it turns out that he's been working the hardest, and he's been right on the spot, and he's been every single day, think of it, every single day, going out there and putting his money where his mouth is, and also not only being there and doing what he needs to do in terms of doing the investigation, but sharing it with all of us, So, you think what you will, but the proof's in the pudding, as they say. Okay, so here we go with a little bit of George, and I'm going to let him tell you the rest of it.
Okay, it's day 30, and this is part 1. And there was an interview by Dan Bongino of Fox News of George Papadopoulos yesterday, and Papadopoulos gave an account of 5 different meetings with 5 different people, and it's probably more like 10 meetings that all were sort of the same MO. It was the weirdest meeting I ever was in. It was the second or third time I met him. I don't know how it happened. All those kind of things where it's like, at what point didn't you realize that you were being set up, if you were being set up? But anyway, I just wanted to go over some of the things he didn't cover. This is the part of cross-examinations that's so much fun. And again, I've only had a few hours to look at his interview on, it was only a radio interview as well, so there's less information to go from. But the first thing he forgot when he was retelling his story about how he kind of got involved with this professor from Malta called Mifsud was he forgot about going to Greece in April and May, meeting with the arms broker in Greece, his favorite buddy named Kamenos. Now, of course, the spell check here misspells it. But when you forget about your meetings with the weapons broker, it reduces your credibility significantly. The other piece to this is, just going through, if you don't remember here, he was working for this company called the London Center of International Law and Practice. Now, I'm not a big Seth Abramson fan here, but he is right here that Mifsud worked there as well. And he was not only a work colleague, which is what Seth Abramson is saying here, that they both worked at the London Center of International Law Practice, but Mifsud was a founder of the London Center of International Law Practice. And what that really is a kind of a meeting point for a bunch of attorneys to talk about trade issues, mostly around maritime law and also pipelines. And a lot of times weapons sales are spoken about in these same meetings. You would know in a firm that size, you would know that person. And Mifsud would have been well known to George Papadopoulos. Well, George Papadopoulos testifies that he never met Mifsud before. He didn't know that this was, first of all, this London Center had lots of spies in it. He didn't know that international espionage was conducted there, especially illegal arms sales. He didn't know that when he went to Rome to meet Mifsud for the first time, that organization, Link University, in Rome was also well known as a spy training center. He didn't even know that Mifsud was very involved in spy training centers. So again, right out of the chute, this interview falls on its face. If you don't remember, this was the web pages have been saved here. Mifsud served prominently in Malta's Ministry of Affairs. Of course, Malta has this history of giving CIA guys who are doing drugs for weapons type trading Knights of Malta distinction, which gives them diplomatic immunity. And he also worked for the Malta Ministry of Education. And here you can see, as we go through here, he was the head of the Energy and Natural Resources. And he used that as well. Papadopoulos used that as a calling card to get on the Trump campaign. So it's very difficult to believe that George Papadopoulos wouldn't have known Mifsud, which is not good because you're starting out your whole re-testimony now. Now that people have disappeared, like Mifsud, you're starting this re-testimony with a lie. The first thing out of the chute. Now this is, if you don't remember who Mifsud is, he is one of the major sources of information for the Steele dossier. And then the other side of the coin here, the Russian side of the coin here, as the key person for information for the Steele dossier, is this Ivan Timofeev. So these meetings go back and forth between Timofeev and Mifsud. And again, here's where, if you've watched this channel, you've done all the homework, it really pays off here. There's going to be this Valdai discussion group that's going to become more important. You've seen me show many pictures of that. So the first thing here is this Link University campus that's on Malta. Well, again, Mifsud would have known well that the Link University in Rome was a spy school, and so would George Papadopoulos. He would know that not only Mifsud set up the Link University campus there, but also the American University campus there, also the Malta Language School there, also the Australian School there, also the University of Malta and the Middlesex University, as well as the Queensborough College. So just by watching our series, you know that Mifsud had an association with all these schools on the very small island of Malta, and you would know very well that when you were going to this Link University, George Papadopoulos would have known, if going on March 14th to this campus, that he was going to a Mifsud spy school. Okay, so we won't belabor that point, but I will just remind everyone.
Sicily, John Podesta, we got Sicily for you right there. And there's Malta. Okay, that's Malta. There's a professor there on Malta. You think about it. He's got schools, okay? One of them's on Malta, right? It's a spy school. He's bringing in spies from everywhere, right, into the Five Eyes, right? The other school he's got is right there in Rome. That's also a spy school. That goes all the way back to Steve Pachenik. The CIA is Mifsud here in London, running the Cambridge spy network, flies these kids. I know this sounds unbelievable. I know it sounds unbelievable. Flies these kids over to the United States, okay? I think we're somewhere in here. I think we're somewhere in there, right? Maryland, D.C., right? Flies them in, and they're staying at these apartments in Laurel, They're staying at these apartments in Laurel, Maryland.
And there you have it. That was May. So now I'm not saying the Awans weren't there as well at the Awan property, but it could be a combination of both, sort of like Big Brother, Little Brother teaching Big Brother teaching Little Brother how to spy. But here you go. If you don't remember, there was this woman, journalist, killed on Malta. Now the sources. So this information is being accumulated from those first two guys, Tim Afiv and Mifsud, and it's coming from different people that are close to Donald Trump. So you're going to have a New York source of information for Donald Trump, and you're going to have a Florida source. If you remember, this guy was in Hollywood, Florida. This is your Florida source. This is Millian. He's also now turned up missing. But now the FBI just can't present this information directly to the Foreign Surveillance Court, and especially to the newspapers. They need to rinse it through somebody. So the person they're going to rinse it through is George Papadopoulos. He's going to have several meetings with Millian. You can see now how George Papadopoulos is in the middle of all this. He's in the middle of communicating with Mifsud here. He's in the middle of communicating with Tim Afiv, and he's in the middle of Millian, right? And he's also going to be in the middle of communicating with Veselnitskaya and Christopher Steele. You're going to find he's going to be meeting with them as well. He just hasn't told us about those meetings yet. But if you want to look beneath the surface, as we've said before, to the times where George Papadopoulos has gone speaking, it's all really about, two things. One, it first starts out about this gas pipeline that we talked about that goes from Israel to the boot of Italy. And I'll just show it here if you forgot about it. There is the East Med pipeline. It goes here from down here in Israel through Cyprus. This is why it's so important to control Cyprus. Then through Crete, then through Greece, and then up here, and then over to Thessalonica, where Frank Justra is, where it tees into the other Turkish pipeline. This is that key pipeline that goes all the way back to Eric Braverman and Brown working on this. And this is what he's working on and especially this link up here, is going to be what generates the FISA. Last night, another prediction of mine came true, that a FISA existed for George Papadopoulos before Carter Page. It's going to be a March FISA, if not earlier. I'm going to say probably all the way back to 2015, maybe even earlier in July timeframe, but it's because of this East Med pipeline. There's obviously a Russian component here in Cyprus, and there's a Russian component here and linking up to this Russian pipeline through Bulgaria here, okay? And that's not only for weapons, but that's also for pipelines there, as you can see. So I'll just remind everybody about this March episode that I did about Sergei Millian, saying that I didn't think he was going to be able to testify. He would never get to Congress to testify.
It's day 145.4, and source D, famous source D for the dossier, for the PP dossier, has now been identified. His name's Sergei Millian. If you've watched the channel, you know that for the last probably 100 days.
But here's the London Center for International Law and Politics, and this is why I say it's so good for weapons consulting and so forth. You've got here maritime issues, boundary issues, and then energy issues, and then diplomacy. And usually they list things in the order of their specialty. But you can see here, if you're an international weapons broker, you could meet there under the cover of being a lawyer for someone to provide a firewall for your client, and then also be able to talk with an energy cover, and then talk weapons at the cocktail hour. And that's
okay. So I'll just that kind of was a little bit abrupt, and so let's just stop that there. Yeah. So for those of you that have been following George, that may not have been a big deal. That might have not been surprising. What I'm trying to do here, having been following George's work and also putting together a lot of other things, because basically what I'm trying to do is to create a place where I can sort of draw some parallels, draw some lines, and also answer some questions, because what Dr. Judy Wood and I were doing when we were doing the Psyop recovery program earlier in the year was we were also taking the questions as well. And so I'm interested in carrying on with that, because I do feel like I have enough of a body of work, but I think it's also great for you, the viewers, to just have these opportunities to go, wait a minute here, because what we're hearing, we have this whole thing of the mainstream media, I think is a bit of a psyop in and of itself, because it's like the MSM. So we automatically go, oh, it's the MSM, or it's this, these are our go-to organizations that we can blame for things, or we can say that it was, it's like the Illuminati and all the rest of it. And I want us to be critical thinkers, where we're not just thinking in terms of, like, that's a placeholder. Dr. Judy calls it the crew. We all have our different way of terming it. But rather than getting too much into a narrative that is being overlaid so that we're distracted, just like with the elephant that is sort of cut up so that the blind people can't tell what it is at all. It wouldn't matter if they got together and said, oh, here's a tail, here's a trunk, they'd never figure out it was an elephant. So what I'm trying to do, I guess, with this process of going through, taking what I know, what I have interviewed people, who have similar ideas. I'm a pattern maker. I'm a filmmaker. I'm a person who actually sees things in the patterns that they make, and I understand that, and I'm able to suspend my decision making, or would it be just isn't decision making, but I'm able to hold a lot of things at one time without having to draw a conclusion. And I've realized that this is kind of an ability that I have that may help other people, because I'm really big in about critical thinking. It doesn't matter what kind of education you've had. In fact, that could be a deficit. On the other hand, I'm not going to say, what a lot of people say, which is, oh yeah, the education system sucks, and so, if you got to erase everything you've learned. No, there's lots of things. A friend of mine, Jim, said, what I learned at university was how to use a library. That was before the internet. So if the only thing that you learned when you went to school, university, whatever, was how to do a report and how to do your research, or how to do citations, I do that a lot. I'm going to university right now, and I have to do citations, and it's a very, very good discipline, because you have to actually go back and look for yourself at where the information came from and be able to somewhat verify it, even if the information itself is BS. On Red Pill Square, on the website, you'll notice that I've got some Wikipedia entries. It's just a placeholder. It's just so that you can find out a little bit more, so you can do your research and know who we're talking about here, because there's a lot of players. So it's kind of like a mind map. You can go back and you can say, oh, okay, even Wikipedia says that this guy's a real person and this is what he does. And in fact, I kind of like Wikipedia in that way, because sometimes George will bring up something, a person who people don't know or haven't heard of, and I go over to Wikipedia, and it's like, it's exactly what he just said, the arms, weapons, Boeing, Lockheed, all those different things. It's just there on the site. And so there's no sense that it's being covered up, or that that he's making things up, and it's not just, I'm not just focusing in on George. It's just using his way of sussing things out, and rather a brave way, I might add, of sussing things out in order to show you, it's another way of looking at a situation. Because I have to say that I was, being a Dan Bongino listener, I find him a bit tedious sometimes, but I do think that he offers some really good information. So I do watch or listen to him, and so I've got nothing. See, this isn't a matter of this person's wrong and this person's right. I think what everyone does is they bring a little bit to the table, and I think in the sense that I'm a little bit like George in there's a part that's willing to go there and say, this person could be part of, they could be a white hat, they could be a black hat, but they're definitely part of the scenario. And I know this was a problem for George when Task Force was alive, and they had a disagreement about Mike Flynn that actually caused them, it caused quite a rift. And I have to say that I know Jason, and I've had my own, there's people that really get into their narrative, or they just go into this place where some people are good and some people are bad. I like the way that George can hold all of these ideas without having to paint people as being good or bad. So I started off talking about Scott Dobert, Scott Adams. I started off talking about him. I'm not saying that he's wrong. I'm not saying he's right. I'm just, my disappointment with him is that he's a public figure and he has quite a platform, and that he would say something like, I haven't been convinced. Well, have you even looked? Because I can show you. I'm just a very I'm just a simple person who's a journalist who's using very simple skills, and I can find an interview with George Soros that will confirm in his own words that he said that he was collaborating in that way. So, and is not embarrassed about it at all. We've already gone over that. But so I just again want to remind you that there is this website, and I do try to I try to keep up with some of the stories. I've got one here just to remind us of the story about the federal prosecutor, that because George will talk about this, where he was found dead on a Hollywood beach. They still haven't figured it out, folks. He's a federal prosecutor, and they can't figure out the story. So, I just add things. This is, again, you'll notice that these are not necessarily contemporary stories, because this was from June 26, 2017. That was a month after the body washed up on the shore. And they're saying, and this is from a local newspaper. Another thing is I want to, and I have a repository, because sometimes things get taken down. So you'll notice there's Cofer Black that George was talking about, and that's from Wikipedia, and that's a very easy one to look up. Special Access Programming talks about America's awesome corruption, especially in military. That talks about Khashoggi, not Jamal, but Adnan Khashoggi. And it sort of just goes to put some context into some of these stories, because there's so many players. And he noticed that in when he was going back on his own video, he's talking about the original story. Like he's talking about the spy ring in Congress. He's talking about that. It's all tied in, folks. And they're trying to confuse us. And I'm amazed that there are people like George, and people that that are just like myself, curious and want to find out. Because can you imagine what would happen if we didn't have these people who just dig in? And we need all the different players. We need the Bonginos. We need the Scott Adams. We need all of these people, because if everyone was just going down the same road, I think we would be in a whole heap of trouble. So it just goes to show you, how convoluted it is, and how difficult it is to explain to our friends who are just going, oh yeah, I think that the world's pretty straightforward. And, so they're still on the MSM thing, so they're way, they haven't even looked out the window to see that there's a dead body on the street. So that's what I'm trying to do here on Red Pill Square, is if you're trying to explain a part of the story, or if you've forgotten who the players are, at least you've got a little bit of context. Like the Venezuela creating fake passports story was one that got CNN kicked out of Venezuela, but it also has the actual footage that you can't find on YouTube. I took it off of their own site. So that's it's helpful, because then you can go, you can show somebody and they can see, oh, okay, so Venezuela does make fake passports, and they were in Baghdad, and they were making them for Syrians, and there may be Syrians in the migrant group. So it's not, as Obama says, just making it up, so you don't have to spend a lot of time on your own trying to convince people. Let people say it in their own words. You've got Obama there going, they're making it up, and then show them the evidence. They're not making it up. So, and it's not just Trump. Trump finds, I just think it's hilarious because Obama may be the exception because he's been in the White House and he knows some of the security stuff. But most of us have no clue what is being reported to a president about the security breaches. So we don't have a clue. So the idea that we can just come up with these pat statements, but clearly Obama is trying to throw us off the scent, right? So again, it's not a partisan thing. It's not about Democrats or Republicans. It's except to the extent that we can see that there's a huge amount of corruption. There's something being covered up in the Democrat Party, because you see Trump's come in, he's clearing the swamp, and and people are running scared, and these are the swamp rats, and they just are. They've chosen, just like George Soros has chosen. You don't need to feel sorry for them. These are people that have chosen, just like we choose every day, to do the right thing or to do the wrong thing. And often people are just trying to cover their butts because they've started off doing the wrong thing and they're going down that road. Now we've got Papadopoulos who's doing exactly the same thing, if George is correct. So again, if you want to take a look, I'm going to sign off, but here's billionaire George Soros spent $33 million bankrolling Ferguson demonstrations to create echo chamber and drive national protests. So in case people want to take a look at this, that's Daily Mail. I try to get it from as mainstream a source as possible so that it doesn't look like some, so people can accuse you of sourcing it from don't know exactly. Oh, it says it's reconnected successfully. But anyway, if you want to take a look at some of this information, you can see George Soros, a psychopath. There's just a lot of information on here, and I'll try and organize it in ways that will make it understandable. But they do kind of go with what George Webb has been talking about, and I try and keep up with what he's doing. And that's the idea, is that this information will help you to at least understand yourself, if not understanding completely, at least have the resources available to be able to show other people. I think it's really, really important, folks, and I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think it was important to help in whatever way I can, whatever skills I can bring to bear, whatever relationships I've forged with people, to be able to bring it to bear and to help you go down the path that I've had to go down myself. And if I can help you to answer some of the questions or provide some of the resources that might help you in that process, then I'm happy to do that, because I think it's really important to, just think about what the world will be like if these are not just people who want power. These are people that are trying to cover up a whole lot of corruption, and it goes so deep and wide. It's unbelievable. And if you see someone like Papadopoulos, who seems like a nice guy, but he's obviously trying to cover up something because he's, it's going to implicate him somehow. I mean, it's going to implicate him because he's somehow got compromised. And I don't think it was through any fault of his own. Flynn could be compromised. So many people have been compromised, and you see how insistent that these the black hats are in getting them compromised. I don't know what I would do in a situation like that. So thank God for people like George Webb, who's bringing it out and who just keeps pushing at it. And thank God for you. And thank you for joining me tonight. And I'm just going to keep plugging away at it. And hopefully you'll bring some friends over and we'll be able to answer some questions and sort of dig into some of this stuff. Anyway, have a great Saturday night. And don't forget to turn your clocks back.